The stone was weeping. That was the first thing I noticed as I stepped into the dark. The walls of the cellar were Here we go. The walls of the cellar were slick, with a condensation that tasted of salt on the back of my tongue. It was a heavy, stagnant cold, not the clean bite of the mountain wind, but the chill of a tomb that had been forced open. My staff struck the floor. Thud. The sound did not echo. The shadows there were too thick. He had swallowed the noise whole. Across the room, the butcher stood. He was a small man, made smaller by his guilt. He wiped the blade with frantic rhythm of a heartbeat, his eyes darting to the wooden vat in the corner. I could smell the brine from where I stood, vinegar, peppercorns, and the sharp metallic tang of life cut short. I found some wild game, he stammered. He was lying. I walked to the tub. With every step, the air grew denser, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I could hear them, not with my ears, but with the marrow of my bones. They were a fractured chorus, three small melodies interrupted in the middle of a note. I placed my hand on the lid. The wood was freezing, saturated with the solution intended to preserve flesh while erasing the soul. Beneath my palm, I felt the stirrings. The salt was biting into them, scouring the memory of life from their skin. The salt stings, doesn't it? I felt the butcher lunge. The whistle of the cleaver cutting the air was a clumsy, desperate sound. I did not turn. I did not need to. The world was made of light and shadow, and I was the master of the threshold. I drove my staff into the earth, and the vibration rippled through the stone, through the brine, through the very fabric of the room. It was a command. It was a refusal to let the dark have the final word. The man hit the floor, not struck by me, but undone by the sheer weight of the presence he had tried to ignore. The lid of the vat heaved. I watched the surface of the dark water break. One, two, three heads. They rose like lilies from a black pond. Their skin was the color of parchment, their eyes wide and glassy with the shock of the in-between. The brine dripped from their chins, splashing back into the barrel. The silence of the cellar was finally broken by a jagged, gasping breath. Life returning. I looked at the butcher, cowering in the corner. He had chosen to end such innocent lives for what? Some material things? What were those worth in comparison to one's immortal soul? I reached out and took the first child's hand. It was wet and shriveled from the salt, but as my fingers closed around theirs, the warmth flooded back. The gray faded. Pulse returned, drumming a frantic, beautiful rhythm against my thumb. For his act of greed, I would match it with an even greater act of charity. After all, what was a greater gift than restoring a life lost, a second chance? I'm Brandon.
And I'm Courtney, and welcome to the Time Travelers Club Holiday Special! Long before he was a figure of folklore wrapped in crimson fur, Nicholas of Myra was a man of bone, blood, and iron. He did not live in a workshop at the North Pole, but in the sweltering, marble-clad heat of the 4th century Asia Minor. His life was not a series of whimsical adventures with elves and winter warlocks and ladies on acid trips. If you know, you know. Instead, it was a gritty struggle for survival against an empire that wanted him dead, and a world that was often cold and cruel to the vulnerable. To understand the real St. Nicholas, we must look past the jolly old soul and find the man who carried the scars of a Roman dungeon on his back and the weight of a starving city on his shoulders. He was a wealthy orphan who chose poverty, a bishop who chose defiance, and a protector who wasn't afraid to use his fists to defend what he believed was right. This is the story of a Greek bishop who toppled goddesses, punched heretics, and transformed his own suffering into a legacy of secret kindness that has outlasted the very empire that tried to chain him. So let's start with some of the core legends, and then get into the history that inspired them.
The city of Patara was sweltering, but for one family, the heat was the least of their worries. A nobleman, ruined by bad investments and misfortune, sat in a house that felt like a tomb. He looked at his 3 daughters and felt a soul-crushing shame. In that era, a woman without a dowry was a social ghost. She could not marry, she could not own property, and she was often forced into, quote, shameful trade of the streets just to eat. Not saying that we think that sex work is shameful, but these were different times, and
Very
these
different times.
stigmas absolutely existed.
Mm-hmm.
Nicholas, having recently inherited a fortune from his parents, heard their plight. He didn't want the family to feel the sting of charity, so he waited until the moon was obscured by the clouds. He crept to the window and tossed a heavy silk purse filled with gold coins. It landed with a thud on the floor. The father woke, weeping with joy, believing it a miracle from heaven. A year later, the second daughter was saved the same way. The gold did just provide a dowry, it provided a future. And then by the third time, the father had grown suspicious. This time, he stayed awake, ears pressed to the door, and when he heard the clink of gold hitting the hearth, some say it fell into a stocking drying by a fire, he bolted outside. He chased the hooded figure through the narrow, winding streets of the city until he caught him by the hem of his cloak. Nicholas fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in a plea for silence. Tell no one, he whispered. This act of stealth giving is why, 1700 years later, we still wait for a visitor who arrives while we sleep.
The next legend will take us away from the city, or even land for that matter. In this tale, the Mediterranean is a fickle beast. One afternoon, a merchant vessel was making its way towards the coast when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind began to howl, a Euroclydon that tore the sails into ribbons. The sailors, hardened men who had seen every corner of the known world, began to throw their cargo overboard, certain they were about to meet their gods. In their terror, they screamed for the Bishop of Myra, whose reputation for holiness had reached every port. Mid-scream, the air on the deck seemed to shimmer and thicken. A figure appeared, clothed in simple robes, his white hair whipping in the gale. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a captain. He grabbed the ropes with his hands that were calloused and real. He stood at the prow of the ship and rebuked the storm as if it were a disobedient child. The waves, which had been mountainous, suddenly flattened into a sheet of dark glass. When the ship finally limped into the harbor at Myra, the sailors ran to the cathedral. They found Nicholas there, finishing a service. He was dry, his robes were clean, and he looked entirely peaceful. When they thanked him for appearing on their deck, he looked at them with piercing eyes and warned them that it was their own desperation and faith that had summoned the miracle, not his own power.
The last legend is the Grimm's fairy tale of St. Nicholas canon, and by that we mean horrific. During a period of horrific famine in Lycia, the world had turned cold and cruel. In a remote tavern along a lonely road, a butcher had lost his mind to greed and hunger. The 3 students, or small children, depending on the teller, were traveling home and sought shelter at an inn. The butcher, seeing them not as guests, but as, in some stories, meat, in others, a source of revenue, murdered them in their sleep. For whatever reason. To hide his crime and prepare for the next day's market, he dismembered their bodies and packed them into a salting tub, layering them with brine to pickle the evidence. That night, a knock came at the door. It was Nicholas. The butcher, sensing the bishop's holy authority, grew pale. Nicholas didn't ask for a room. He asked to see the cellar. He walked straight to the brining tub, the air in the room turning heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient powder. Nicholas didn't just pray, he commanded. He struck the side of the wooden barrel with his staff and called out to the little ones to wake up. To the horror and wonder of the butcher, the 3 children sat up in the brine, their skin whole, their breath returned, as if they had merely been napping. They began to sing praises. This story, violent, dark, and ultimately triumphant, is why Nicholas is often depicted in medieval art standing next to a tub with 3 small figures popping out of it.
While the tales of gold bags and pickled children feel like they belong in a book of fairy tales, they're anchored to a very real, very stubborn man who walked the dusty roads of the Roman Empire. To find the historical Nicholas, we have to travel back to the late 3rd century to a world of marble temples, Roman legions, and a burgeoning, often illegal, new faith called Christianity. Nicholas was born around the year 270 AD in the sun-drenched port city of Patara, located in the region of Lycia, modern-day Turkey. At the time, this was a vibrant Greek-speaking province of the Roman Empire. He wasn't born into poverty. His parents, Theophanes and Nona, were wealthy and devout Christians, a dangerous combination in an era where the Roman state still viewed Christianity as a threat to the social order. According to historical tradition, Nicholas was an only child, and his birth was seen as a miracle after years of his parents' infertility. The storytale version of his youth often claims that even as an infant, Nicholas was so holy that he would only nurse once on fast days. But the historical reality was much harsher. While Nicholas was still a young man, a devastating epidemic swept through Lycia. Both his parents succumbed to the plague, leaving the young Nicholas an orphan with a massive inheritance of gold and property. In the Roman world, a young man of his status would typically use that wealth to bide political influence or live a life of leisure. Instead, Nicholas took the words of Jesus, "Sell what you own and give the money to the poor," literally. Now, for a historical note, this is the bridge where the legend of the 3 gold bags meets the historical fact. The dowry story is the traditional explanation for how he began liquidating his family's fortune to serve his community.
Yeah, and just like a couple notes about that story I just find interesting. And I feel like you see this with a lot of the early saints and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that his parents were older and they miraculously had this child, it does harken back to the story of like Mary, whose parents were also considered to be quite old and weren't supposed to have kids, and by the miracle of God were given Mary. So it's like this idea that a child like this would be born destined for great things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, Nicholas didn't stay in Patara for long. Nicholas didn't stay in Patara to enjoy his status. Seeking a deeper connection to his faith, he traveled as a young man, apparently, to Egypt and Palestine, walking the same streets where the foundations of his religion were supposedly laid. When he returned to Lycia, he didn't go home to Patara. Instead, he moved into the bustling metropolitan city of Myra, modern-day Demaray. He arrived at a chaotic moment. The Bishop of Mira had just died, and the local leaders were deadlocked on who would replace him. In this story, it goes that the senior priest had a dream that the first person to enter the church for morning prayers the next day should be the new bishop. At dawn, a young travel-worn Nicholas walked through the doors to pray. Before he could even set down his bags, he was seized and consecrated right there and then as the Bishop of Mira. Now, this is where we have caveats. There's a lot of legend associated with him, right? And the first three we picked out were the specifically clearly legends, right? Bringing pickled kids back to life, telling the ocean, hey, stop that. And it listened, right? Also, he teleported, which was pretty cool.
Listening.
Right. Like maybe the gold giving thing was a thing. It seems a little wild, but there's at least no magic there, right? No crazy stuff. But though there's a lot of his story where we go, might be an exaggeration, might be myth, right? So here's another version of that story that people feel might be more historically accurate. So, and of course, it's made even more plausible because it involves mild nepotism. So Nicholas was not apparently a lone wanderer who just happened to find his way into the church by accident. Rather, his path was deeply influenced by his family because specifically his paternal uncle, who was also named Nicholas, served as the Bishop of Patara.
Ah, well, that makes sense.
Right. Which, I mean, makes sense. These are small communities, right? Christianity was pretty underground at this point. Right. So, but he was a man of significant influence who recognized the unique fire in his nephew from an early age. That could all be true. He could have been a very religious, devout person. That can all be true. It just doesn't seem kosher to status quo. It's just like some rando guy, like he's our new boss. Like, what are your? But I don't have. But I don't have. Do you want to know my qualifications? Doesn't matter. I mean, maybe,
possibly.
But probably not. But this also makes more sense to me. So after his parents died during that plague, his uncle became his legal guardian and a spiritual mentor. He didn't just teach the young Nicholas about scriptures. He watched as the boy spent his nights in prayer and his days in the church, behaving with a wisdom that surpassed his years. So, like, again, makes more sense. Young, has all this money, right? Like, he can't just leave him on his own. He's got a guardian. And his guardian happens to be religious, who's going to teach him his religious beliefs. Makes sense. Makes more sense to me. But what do I know? However, the elder Nicholas eventually decided that his nephew's devotion was a gift that belonged to the whole community. In a formal ceremony in Patara, the elder bishop ordained his nephew as a priest. And legend has it that as his uncle laid his hands on him, he turned to the congregation and prophesied, I see a new sun rising over the earth. Blessed is the flock that shall have this man as their shepherd. And the trust between them was so absolute that when the elder Bishop Nicholas decided to make a long-term pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he did something radical even for the time. He left his young nephew in charge of the entire diocese. Nicholas didn't just keep the seat warm, he managed the church's affairs with such rigor and compassion that he became a local legend before he was even 30. It was this early training under his uncle that prepared him for the moment he would eventually be called to the great city of Mira to take on his own mantle as bishop. So, see, we have more of a through line here, right? Makes more sense. Rather than him wandering the desert, right? Because it's a lot of allegory. Again, this is just him, right? He's just going from Patara, where he goes essentially to school and spends time there. And then when a position opens up at this other place, he transfers over and he's proven that he can handle it. Makes sense.
Makes more sense than just the first person in shall take it. That
I mean, and
guy
again, it makes a good story. It's fun. This one was boring, but the boring one makes more sense. Like, um,
does.
right. So the transition from Patara to Mira is where history and destiny collided. Mira was the metropolis of the region, and when its bishop died, the local clergy were in a deadlock. As we discussed earlier, apparently a vision led them to the doors of the church at dawn where they found young Nicholas. But they did not just find a stranger in this case. They would have found a man who had been trained for this very moment by one of the most respected bishops in the province. So, the golden years of Nicholas's early leadership were soon swallowed by by one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. In 303 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian issued a series of edicts aimed at wiping Christianity off the map. This wasn't just a political disagreement, though. It was a great persecution designed to dismantle the church entirely. For Nicholas, the newly consecrated Bishop of Myra, the storm had moved from the sea to his very doorstep.
So, as the leader of the Christians in Myra, Nicholas was a primary target. He was seized by Roman magistrates, stripped of his fine episcopal robes, and dragged through the streets he had once walked as a protector. He was thrown into a cramped, lightless dungeon alongside other confessors, men and women who had refused to renounce their faith even under the threat of death. For years, Nicholas lived in the filth of a Roman prison. Historical accounts suggest that he was likely tortured. Ancient records of his physical remains show that he had a broken nose that had healed crookedly, a silent testament to the violence he may have endured at the hands of his jailers. Yet, even in chains, Nicholas remained a brave shepherd. He spent his days encouraging his fellow prisoners, urging them to remain brave under the fetters, and to fear no earthly punishment. To understand why Nicholas was thrown into a dungeon, we have to understand the mind of Emperor Diocletian. He wasn't simply a villain in a vacuum. He was a man obsessed with order, tradition, and the survival of a crumbling empire. By the time Nicholas was a young bishop, the Roman Empire was gasping for air. It had endured decades of civil war, economic collapse, and plagues. Diocletian, a brilliant but cold-blooded administrator, believed that there was only one way to save Rome: the Great Restoration. The Romans believed in a concept called Pax Deorum. It was a spiritual contract. If the people sacrificed to the traditional Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, the gods would protect the borders of the empire. Diocletian looked at the chaos of the 3rd century and concluded that the gods were angry. Why? Because a new group, the Christians, refused to participate in the state rituals. To Diocletian, Christians weren't just practicing a different religion. They were political subversives and spiritual saboteurs. Their refusal to burn incense to the emperor was seen as an act of treason that invited divine wrath upon the Roman people. The spark that lit the fire happened in 299 AD. Diocletian was attending a ceremony where priests were reading the entrails of sacrificed animals to predict the future, a practice called haruspicy, which it was practiced a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
I've done my research on that, and woo,
Well, it was.
technically
I mean,
it's useful.
well, I mean, it was also. This is an old tradition, right? It sounds, I think, a little wild to us now, like people who either aren't well versed in it, right, because of Christianity, but during Roman times, I mean, this was something that they did dur- during even like Caesar, right? That was part of his story. Was like
Mhm.
they opened up and like they saw that the entrails had just were gone and missing and like or gone black or whatever, and like that was a bad omen, bad sign. So like I mean they did like this reading of entrails, and they had it's a very old tradition. It goes way, 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 way back.
Yeah, and truly think about it this way: if you have livestock, um, this is like an autopsy, seeing what's going on
Oh
the
yeah.
internals on the internal sphere of the animal. And yeah, it can show you that hey, something's wrong with your fields because they're not getting nutrition. Something's fucked up
Oh
here.
yeah. I would say that's probably where it started, right? And
Mhm.
maybe people just didn't make me quite, and from a non-spiritual perspective, right? Just maybe didn't make the through line. So like if we're going back Roman, we're pastoralists, right? Originally, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, like if your flock's dying, you open it up and inside it's cancerous and blackened or whatever. Take They're like, oh, that can't be good, and they're going to view that as a sign of the gods being displeased, right? So then
Absolutely.
they're like, okay, well, that's how the gods tell they're not happy. So then, if I'm trying to see, is my political career going to be okay? Apparently, we're going to do that, and that's going to mean the same thing. Now, like you just said, it's almost like an autopsy. And like, if scientifically we know that maybe there was some kind of disease or plague going on, and that's going to, you're right, going to be a bad sign for the future. Because if your flocks are dying, how are you going to eat? How are you? It's going to be a bad winter. It's going to be a whatever, right?
Exactly.
Or there could be something going on in the area, like a poisonous plant or something in the air, right? Like they're not making that correlation though. They're just saying like they know that the gods are in charge of this. So, in one sense, yes, it could be used to accurately predict maybe we should get out of this area, and they don't even know why, other than the gods told them to. And
Mhm.
little did they know, yeah, it's because there's like some horrible disease there that's killing your animals. But
Yeah.
at the same time, they can use it to inaccurately question mark. I'm not touching that one. Like predict that, like, oh, um, yeah, because this random pig's, well, in this case, it's usually like a sheep or a cow,
Mhm.
entrails are discolored. It must mean that my political career is at stake.
Well, technically,
Within
your political career is also tied to the bellies of your people at this point
that's
in
true.
time. So, technically,
Yeah,
it's not wrong.
it's not wrong. It's right,
But
exactly. But with that being said, um, it's something else to kind of keep in mind too is if with Diocletian in particular, it could all be very religious for him, and that's all true.
yeah,
And we've discussed before how with the Romans, religion and the idea of state are pretty intertwined.
yeah,
Modern us like to think that they had separate, but they really didn't, right? Hence the kinky boots. But
yeah.
wasn't just a fashion choice. So,
No,
but with that being said, it also was very much political, right? If you have
very
a
much
group
so.
of people who won't adore you and aren't afraid of you, that could be a problem,
And it's definitely something to be concerned about.
right?
But
Because they're not loyal to you. They're like, we can ignore you if we think you're wrong because we have someone else that we believe is more important than you.
yeah.
Yeah.
So when Diocletian was in there, while the priests were reading the entrails to predict his future, the priests failed to find any omens in the organs. The animals were healthy. They claimed that profane persons, Christian officials in the emperor's own household, were making the sign of the cross, which blocked the gods from speaking. It sounds more like the priests weren't actually versed in how to fucking do hairspray,
Or,
realistically, or it
or,
was a good fucking omen. Hey, your animals are
right,
healthy. Be
right. And I
happy.
was going to say, or it's like, how do we, because it sounds like we were trying to find a reason, like, oh, if it had been a bad omen, like, well, now see, the gods are displeased, so let's kill the Christians. And they're like, shit, they're healthy. Um, oh, they're healthy because of yeah. It sounds like they were spinning it.
Oh,
But
they were
to me,
really
that's what it
spin
sounds like.
doctor.
That's all it was.
We're
Like,
going through the washing machine, absolutely. But Diocletian was livid. He ordered that everyone in the palace and the army must sacrifice to the gods or be dismissed. In 303 AD, Diocletian, urged by his more radical Caesar, Galerius, unleashed a series of laws specifically designed to dismantle the Christian state within a state. Edict 1. All churches were to be leveled to the ground and scriptures burned. Edict 2. All Christian clergy, including Nicholas, were to be arrested and imprisoned. Edict 3. Clergy were to be tortured until they agreed to sacrifice to the Roman gods. And Edict 4. All citizens, everywhere, were required to sacrifice on pain of death. Here's the thing. Anytime, in any religion, if you have
Mm-hmm.
someone making edicts like this, where you have to follow what I'm telling you to follow, you have to believe what I'm telling you to believe under pain of death, fuck them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Like, usually we're kind of on the other side of this because, spoiler alert, Christians persecute people later on. But,
Yes.
which is, the irony is not lost here.
No, it's not. It very much reads Israel. Ooh, I didn't say that.
Well, I mean, even beyond that, it's like the irony here is, and like your people were all these, think about Edict 1, 2, 3, and 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
We did that. Christians did that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet their religion's founded on because of these kinds of things being done to them. And it's like, so that's how, like, it's really funny. Like, you're going to enact the very things that your people suffered through. You know what I'm saying? Like,
exactly.
So, but with all that being said, Nicholas, of course, was the bishop of Myra at this time, and Myra was a major shipping hub. If Diocletian wanted to break the spirit of the province, he was going to have to break the leaders. By arresting Nicholas, the Roman magistrates hoped to create a vacuum of leadership. They believed that if the people saw their holy man in chains, bleeding and humiliated, they would realize that the Roman gods were the true masters of the world. And this is why they would fail, because this religion actually celebrated those people. You're feeding into it.
You're feeding the martyrdom. Come on now.
Right. And that's what made this religion, honestly,
explode.
so hard to kill. Because the more you fight it, the more ammunition you're giving them, which is what most religions weren't like that, up until this time. Up until that point, like, Romans had been pretty chill about adopting a lot of different religions and things like that, and deities and things like that. Sometimes they rebranded them, said like, oh, the Germans, worshipped Mercury, and it turns out it wasn't Mercury. They were just like, I don't know what to call him. He looks kind of like our guy. But they weren't telling people they have to die over it. But the only other time they really did this up until that point was like with the Druids and the Jews from time to time, but really the Druids. But Christians with their martyrdom, that was really something they had no idea how to work with that, as it will become clear. And so they underestimated Nicholas. Instead of prison breaking him, it became his pulpit. Every day he spent in that cell was a day he proved that his God was more enduring than the emperor's iron. And when the Great Persecution began in 303, it was the most systematic attempt to purge Christianity the Roman Empire had ever seen. The emperor did not want to stop the religion. He wanted to erase its memory. And he was ordering the burning of all the scriptures, the destruction of churches. It's just big mad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Nicholas was, of course, a high value target, because so when the Roman soldiers came for him, So when the soldiers came, they likely dragged him from his cathedral, stripped him of all of his vestments, and forced him into a Roman dungeon system. So let's talk about that. I'm sure it's like a retreat, right?
Totally.
Right. Like, as we
Who
knew
doesn't
with
like
the
a thumbs down?
whole, Like the hole where Mark Anthony's stepdaddy was choked to death. This isn't the same people, guys. So, so the prisons of the 4th century were not like modern correctional facilities, which are not great. They were holding pens at best for execution or slow death through neglect. Nicholas would have been thrown into a subterranean cell, cramped, damp, infested, and that's how he would live for the next 8 years.
Yuck.
Yikes. I just think of that scene from like Disney Aladdin when like you got Jafar as like the little old man.
Yes.
This guy. Like that's the vibe.
Very much so.
For 8 years. Except worse, because at least Aladdin bounced out pretty quick. He didn't have time to see like what amenities were being offered. But let's talk about those. Nicholas lived in a state of living martyrdom. He was a confessor, a title given to those who were tortured for their faith but did not die. Some of the physical tolls to talk about: historical forensics exams of his supposed bones, performed in the 1950s, revealed that the man we call Santa Claus had a severely broken nose and suffered from chronic arthritis, likely exacerbated by the damp, freezing conditions of his imprisonment, if this is the same person. We'll get into that at some point. The spiritual toll was also there. He wasn't alone in there. He was surrounded by deacons and lay people. History tells us that Nicholas took on the role of a shepherd of the shadows, while his captors pressed him to offer a pinch of incense to the Roman gods to secure his freedom. Nicholas spent his energy shouting encouragements through the stone walls to other prisoners, reminding them that their suffering had meaning. In these prisons, food was often only provided if family members or friends brought it to the gates. Because so many Christians were being arrested at once, many starved. It's haunting to think that the man who would eventually be known for bringing feasts and treats, fat and jolly on Coca-Cola, which is also fattening, likely spent nearly a decade surviving on scraps of moldy bread and putrid water. We could argue that's kind of what Coca-Cola is, but I like Coke. This period of his life is crucial, though, because it explains his legendary temper later on. He didn't just study theology in a library, he bled for it. When he eventually walked out of those prison doors in 311 or 313 AD, following the Edicts of Toleration, he wasn't just a bishop anymore. He was a veteran of a spiritual war. So the world shifted on its axis in 313 AD. The new emperor, Constantine the Great, maybe you heard of him, had this little thing called Constantinople, issued the Edict of Milan, which finally legalized Christianity. The prison doors swung open, and a gaunt, battered Nicholas walked out into the sunlight of Myra. He didn't return as a broken man, though, but was celebrated as a hero. His survival and refusal to break under torture earned him that title, confessor. He returned to the Cathedral of Myra, and the people didn't just see a bishop, they saw a living martyr. When Nicholas finally returned to the streets of Myra, he was a changed man, though. His skin would have been pale from years without sun, his body thinned by famine, and his face permanently marked by the blows of his jailers. The people of Myra did not see a broken victim, though. They saw a man who had stared down the might of the Roman Empire and hadn't blinked. This hard-won authority is what gave him the power to stand up to corrupt governors and rowdy sailors in the years that followed. The transition from the darkness of the dungeon to the light of freedom was not a sudden burst of sunshine, but a slow tectonic shift in the Roman world. In 311 AD, the dying emperor Galerius, because Diocletian be dead, which, man, could you imagine you were arrested by one and like lived through another, and then that one had to die before you got out of jail. Holy crap! Um, he had been one of the most vicious of the persecutors, though. He issued a deathbed decree of tolerance. Apparently, I think maybe, and when he died, people back walked some of these policies back. That's my.
Mm.
I don't think he had a last minute change of heart. Maybe. But the true liberation for Nicholas would come with the rise of Constantine the Great. And that came with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD.
Nicholas did not return to Myra to rest or seek a pension. He returned with a holy ferocity. He believed that the Roman gods who had sanctioned his torture were not just false, but demonic. His first major act of his release was a direct assault on the religious heart of the city, the great temple of Artemis. Yeah, kind of fuck you, Nicholas, for that. Artemis.
Yeah, this is where it's going to be awkward because it's like, I think it's funny if they hadn't imprisoned him. I mean, you have to think that he is big mad. I mean,
Well,
and
yeah.
that'll do it. Yeah. Over a decade of being imprisoned and beaten and
Yeah.
tortured for not worshiping those sets of gods. And then now you come out. Yeah, you're going to come out and be like, fuck all of you. And unfortunately, it's kind of unfortunate. It's a cycle.
It is a cycle, and unfortunately, we are going through the other side of it right now. But
Mm-hmm.
I want you to really, really take this in. He went after the woman first.
Yes. And we're going to discuss specifically why.
Yep.
It's not just that it was a goddess, but specifically who. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we'll get into it.
Artemis was the patron goddess of the region, and her temple in Myra was a massive, opulent structure that rivaled the wonders of the world. For Nicholas, this wasn't just a building, it was the throne of the power that had tried to crush his people. According to tradition, Nicholas didn't wait for a legal decree. He led a band of emboldened Christians to the temple. With his own hands, the same hands that had been bound in a cell, he began to tear down the altars. He ordered the massive pillars to be toppled and the idols smashed to dust. To understand why Nicholas's assault on the Temple of Artemis was such a seismic event, we have to look past the stony walls. In the ancient world, the temple wasn't just a church. It was the center of a city's economy, its social identity, and most importantly, the primary source of female power.
And this wouldn't be limited to just here.
Mm-hmm.
Right around the same time, someone I want to cover someday is a little known lady. Depends on who you are. It may actually be little known to some people, but Hypatia of
Hypatia.
Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
Hypatia
Yeah.
of Alexandria. And she also, it's really like eerie, the parallels. You have a bishop who takes the Christians, marches them to the temple without the consent of the governor or anything like that, and just take it upon themselves to tear everything down. And in this particular story, anyone down who represents something not within the Christian order, heathen,
Yep.
whatever. And in her case, science was the heathen here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she was a woman.
It the thing is with Christianity, and I'm gonna state this, it's always the women first.
And you know what's really ironic? Because up until this point, right? And it's when Christianity kind of becomes more like a state thing, right? When it's part of the government now, right? Or becoming
Mm-hmm.
part of the government. Women were cherished. Women were champions of this religion, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, thank you for your services, ma'am. Now step aside.
Mm-hmm. No,
And then
and
anyone, then, yeah.
it's to me it's kind of hilarious where women who do not believe what you believe are somehow supposed to pay the price for
Mm-hmm.
your first fictional woman.
Yeah. Well, even then, like at this point, like there's a lot of evidence that shows like early church figures were women,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially in the first couple centuries. Like women were leader of congregations. Leaders, women were, it would be like they were the Christian pillar in that community, the ones who would hide people away and things like that. The patrons, the like legit preachers and things like that. Because this was a religion that was like, no, we accept all the downtrodden. And who were some of the most downtrodden people in especially Roman society?
Women.
Women. So with that being said, I mean, there's such an irony to all this, right? And
Mm-hmm.
um, I think it's an accident? No, but this is where we're starting to see that shift of, and we see it with a lot of societies and religion, especially in the West, where once they become kind of like state recognized or more mainstream, I don't know why. That's a different. That's not my expertise, but there's this trend of patriarchy.
Yep. Yep. But the temple of Artemis in Mira and its more famous sister in Ephesus was a marvel of the Mediterranean. Artemis was the lady of the wild things, the protector of women in childbirth, and the guardian of the hunt. Her cult was thousands of years old, deeply rooted in the soil of Anatolia long before the Romans or even the Greeks arrived. In Mira, the temple was likely the wealthiest institution in the province. It served as a bank, a sanctuary for refugees, and a massive employer. But the true engine of the temple was the women. In the Roman Empire, women generally had very few paths to public authority. They couldn't vote, hold office, or lead armies. The cult of Artemis was the great exception. For the high priestesses, the temple was overseen by a hierarchy of women who held immense political and economic sway. These priestesses managed vast estates, controlled temple treasuries, and negotiated with Roman governors. Artemis was a virgin goddess who required no man. For her priestesses and followers, the temple offered a life of autonomy. A woman dedicated to Artemis wasn't defined by her husband or her father. She was defined by her sacred office. The temple was the headquarters for the city's midwives and healers. If a woman was in danger or in labor, she fled to the shadow of Artemis. And really, I do want to make this as a call forward. This sounds and feels very much like one of the first ripples of a witch trial.
Well, I kind of give when you look at like the clinics and stuff like that, right? For like women's health
Yeah.
that are being attacked right now, right?
It's all witch
Because
trials
we
and
can't give
all of
women
them.
agency. It's like they're doing abortions there. It's like sure, and they're doing a lot of other things too, like not
Absolutely.
just that, like women's
Absolutely.
health and exams and you know, Planned Parenthood. As in, if you want to be a parent, they have tools to help you be that too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not the point. The point is that these women don't need a man. They can be independent and you find this resource to help you be that if you want to be.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
So when Nicholas returned from prison, he didn't just see idolatry. He saw a rival power structure. By toppling the temple, Nicholas was participating in a massive empire wide shift that fundamentally changed the role of women in society. As the old religion was dismantled, the public offices held by priestesses vanished. In the early Christian church of the 4th century, leadership was increasingly centralized in the hands of male bishops and priests. While Christianity offered women a different kind of spiritual equality, the bride of Christ or the nun, it stripped away the visible civic power that the Temple of Artemis had provided. Nicholas effectively stole the job description of Artemis. She was the protector of children and the guardian of the vulnerable. Nicholas became the patron saint of children and the defender of the poor. He absorbed her roles, but the administration of that protection moved from a female led temple to a male led cathedral. By destroying the idols and the altars, Nicholas essentially bankrupted the local female nobility who funded and ran the temple. The wealth that once flowed into the temple's coffers was redirected to the church's charity programs, overseen by Nicholas and his deacons. Tradition says that when Nicholas attacked the temple, he specifically targeted the sacred tree, or the largest idols. He wanted to prove that Artemis, the great protectress, could not even protect herself. The decline of the Temple of Artemis under Nicholas's hammer was the final nail in the coffin for the ancient Anatolian tradition of female religious governance. The Lady of Mira was replaced by the Bishop of Mira. By destroying the Temple of Artemis, Nicholas sent a message. The old world is over. The gods of the empire have no power here. And honestly, that makes me sick.
It makes me sad more than anything else. It's tragic. What's annoying, honestly, is like, again, like you said, no, I don't think he did. I mean, it's people who attribute things to him later, like long after everyone here's dead. But like, yeah, it's like, oh, like, well, now he's attributed to those things. He's given those, and the church is given those things. And it's like, yeah, but they were doing it before he was there. Like, and they're not going to be. It's like you go men running these churches and stuff. It's like, oh, well, we don't want women to have an option to have any kind of autonomy. If a woman flees to the Temple of Artemis and goes, my husband's beating the shit out of me, they'll shelter her and probably not ask too many questions and try to help her out financially or whatever. Male church leaders, probably not so much.
Oh, absolutely not. I have actually,
No.
I have heard this verbatim right in front of me. What did you do to make him angry?
Uh-huh. And like that's the thing, is like I'm not saying that they couldn't have done that too. They may have, but it was the point that like we see some of that happening now. It's part of these older traditions and these cycles. And it does make me sad because it's like, no, these were wealthy women. They probably weren't always super, I'm sure they had their own stigmas and biases and stuff, but like I want to do like maybe a episode one day on Artemis and like the Temple of Ephesus in particular, like that area, because like it is different than the Greek vibes. But yeah, it was just like this community of strong women who had pride in themselves and autonomy and like the sisterhood and things like that, and it just gets smashed to pieces. So because men don't like the idea of unregulated women.
Yeah.
And it scares them. And they feel like they should have those things and that power and that ability. Like, well, why are women judging who gets help or not? We should be the ones doing that. And I'm not saying anyone should be making, like, you should be unbiased, period. But, like, I don't care who does it. If it was a dude or a chick, I don't care. But, like, it's the fact that we know that what's going to happen when men take over here, right?
Yeah.
Um,
That's the
and
big part.
men still had their spaces. They still had spaces to go to for when they needed help, but they were not the ones in most need, right? They had more legal authority and agency and things like that. This was a system designed specifically to help women in a world where they didn't have those things. The one shot, not just for the people who work there, but for the women in that community to, God forbid, get away from, like I said, their abusive husband, or when there's no doctors who know what to do. Like, you have experienced people who are like, we do this every day to help you with like childbirth and things like that. Like, that's what they're there for. And you
Women
took that
helping
away.
women, and it was taken. And it just...
And not even taken as an, ooh, like I'm taking it over. No, like just gone.
Yeah.
Period. Like, like, yeah, sure, you might have some nuns and things like that, but if the bishop goes, you can't help this woman, the nun literally can't do nothing about it.
Exactly.
There's stories about that in history where like a nun goes, no, I'm going to still help this person. They get in trouble. Like, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know. So let's get back to Christmas. So, and some backhands. The fisticuffs. So after all that, he also had to deal with the practical wreckage of his persecution. The economy had been shattered, and localized famine was beginning to take hold in Lycia. This is where the historical Nicholas earns his name, his Santa reputation or saint reputation, through a very specific, gritty miracle involving grain ships. The story goes that a fleet of ships laden with wheat from the emperor in Constantinople dropped anchor in the harbor of Myra. The people were starving. Nicholas had went down to the docks and apparently had done something remarkably bold. He didn't beg the captains. He demanded they give him a portion of the grain. The captains were terrified, apparently, and the grain was weighed to the ounce. And if they arrived in the capital short, they would be executed. Like, dude, we're just doing our job. So Nicholas apparently looked them in the eye and gave him his word. Give to the hungry, and I promise you will lose nothing. I guess the captain apparently threw up his hands. And so they unloaded enough grain to feed Myra for 2 years. I don't know why they did that, but whatever. When the ships reached Constantinople, the grain was weighed before the emperor, and apparently not a single pound had been missing. And the scales balanced perfectly. Okay. So in 325 AD, the world, as we had said, was changing. And Constantine the Great had unified the empire again. But he was frustrated to find that while he had legalized Christianity, the Christians themselves were on the verge of a civil war over a single word of theology. He's like, y'all, like, to settle the matter, he summons the Council of Nicaea. And he's pretty much like, y'all, you're saying this is the way, you're saying this story counts, you're saying that story doesn't count, and then you're saying it should be read this way, you're saying things should be read that way. Y'all, so he's like, I'm setting y'all down. We're hashing this out. Because if my government's going to have you as the state religion, and I'm supposed to make laws off of this. I need everyone to fucking agree on what I'm writing. I mean, it makes sense. It's practical. I'm not saying I don't love governments that are based off religion, but hey, you know what? If you're going to do that, y'all should agree on what that is. You got it. So, but this was the first time in history that the bishops from every corner of the known world, from Egypt, from Gaul, all gathered in one place. And among them was Nicholas, still carrying the scars of Diocletian's prison.
The council centered on a charismatic priest named Arius. He was a tall, slender man with a silver tongue who argued a very specific point: that Jesus Christ was a created being. Arius famously sang his doctrines in catchy jingles to convince the masses, claiming there was a time when the sun was not. To the modern ear, this sounds like a technicality, but to Nicholas, this was an existential threat. If Jesus wasn't fully God, then the faith Nicholas had been tortured for was a lie. He sat in the grand hall, watching Arius use clever logic and Greek philosophy to deconstruct the divinity of Christ. Nicholas was not a philosopher. He was a witness. As Arius continued to speak, Nicholas's temper, the same fire that had fueled the destruction of the Temple of Artemis, boiled over. In a moment that has become the most famous unsaintly act in history, Nicholas stood up, marched across the floor of the council, and struck Arius across the face.
Which I love. It's so fast.
Bitch slap heard around the world.
The end. It's just, God, could you imagine? Just like, It's just like you've got this guy who's like making an argument. He's debating and he's orating his life, and like up, 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 and then just this random guy gets up quietly, walks across the room at mid speech, I like to think, and just wham! And everyone's just dead silent.
And this is why I don't like Santa. So the
It's just
hall
I find
fell
it funny.
the hall fell into a stunned silence. You did not strike a man in the presence of the emperor. It was a breach of protocol so severe that the other bishops had no choice but to act.
I
They
like
were
that. That's the problem here.
Oh,
That's the problem.
absolutely.
Not the fact that he assaulted a man. It's the fact that he assaulted a man in front of the emperor. Like, oh,
Yep.
like really?
They were horrified that a man of God would resort to common brawling. Nicholas was immediately stripped of his omophorion, the long embroidered scarf that marks a bishop's authority, and his copy of the Gospels. He was once again thrown into a cell, and this time by his own brothers in the faith. However, the legend takes a mystical turn that night. It is said that when Nicholas sat in his cell, ashamed but unrepentant, Jesus and the Virgin Mary appeared to him, and Jesus asks, "Why are you here?" Nicholas replied, "Because I love you." In the vision, Jesus handed him the Gospels, and Mary draped the bishop's scarf back over his shoulders. The next morning, when the jailers came to check on him, they found him peacefully reading his scriptures, dressed in the very vestments they had locked away in a separate chest. Terrified, the bishops realized that they had judged his manners. God had judged his heart, and they restored him to the council immediately.
So, with that being said, legend. Okay, now I could absolutely believe that he pimp slapped the hell out of this guy. Okay, and by doing that, he opened a whole can of whoopsie daisies. Okay, um, but I could also believe that rather than that, maybe he's like they decided, well, before we throw the book at him, he was just in his defense, he's just so passionate about his religion, he just acted, everyone's okay, right? Like no one's like broken, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we just let him out, sit him down, like because he is, and that's the other thing. You probably have people who are on his side because this is almost political, right? Like who
Mm-hmm.
are outraged that they imprisoned him. So there's probably a political element to it. He's like one of the most important bishops in like the Christian world. Like locking him up, maybe not a good look for long term, right? I'm more inclined to believe that than magically reappearing close, but maybe that happened too. I don't know. So Nicholas did return to Mira as now a pillar of orthodoxy. He had survived the Romans, toppled a goddess, and fought heretics. But as he aged, his fierce side apparently softened into the legendary protector we recognize today. He spent his final years ensuring that the poor of Mira were fed and that the innocent were protected from corrupt governors. But he would eventually die on December 6th of 343 AD. The history of St. Nicholas remains a complex journey involving archaeological mystery, medieval theft, and scientific verification. While tradition long held that he was first buried in Mira, because of course the story doesn't end here, folks, recent evidence suggests his original 4th century tomb may have actually been on Gemili Island off the Turkish coast. His body was likely moved to Mira in the 7th century to protect it from Arab naval raids. During his centuries in Mira, his tomb became famous for producing a miraculous liquid known as manna or myrrh, which I'm hoping they weren't smoking his juices.
God, I hope not. That's disgusting.
Anyway, but this solidified his reputation as a wonder worker, apparently. God, please don't drink. God, there's so many things I'm worried about here.
Yep.
Did they drink the juices, smoke them? Oh, anyway.
Incense
The
burning.
most
I don't know.
I don't know. Uh, So, the most significant turning point occurred, though, in 1087 when Italian sailors from Bari seized the majority of his skeleton from Mira because this is what happens. This act is often described by historians as a, quote, holy robbery, though people of Bari justified it as a rescue mission, because they always do, to save the relics from the invading Seljuk Turks. Maybe true, maybe not. Shortly after, during the First Crusade, Venetian sailors collected the remaining bone fragments left behind in his original tomb. Modern scientific examinations have since confirmed that the remains held in Bari and those in Venice are anatomically compatible and belong to the same individual. Over the centuries, small fragments of the saint, such as fingers, teeth, and ribs, were distributed across Europe and Russia as a diplomatic gifts or spoils of war, because that's what everyone wants for Christmas: Santa's finger bone.
Disgusting.
Or Santa's tooth. I want Santa's tooth.
Blah.
that that song, All I Want for Christmas is Two Front Teeth, and it's Santa's. Yikes.
Oh
Pickled kid.
no.
Oh no, we've got pickled kids, bitch slaps, teeth, all of it.
Blah.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
This is Merry Chrysler. This dispersion helped establish St. Nicholas, though, as a universal patron, specifically for sailors, because that whole commanding the ocean to stop being the ocean thing, travelers, because apparently he traveled a lot, even though sometimes we don't know that, and of course, prisoners, because he was locked up twice. Today, the Basilica di San Nicola in Bari remains the primary pilgrimage site, and the tomb continues to be a point of international cooperation. For instance, a rib was loaned to Russia in 2017, because we're still doing it, folks,
Gross.
drawing millions of devotees. In recent years, the remains have become a subject of modern diplomatic and archaeological interest. The Turkish government has formally requested the return of the bones from Italy, arguing they were taken illegally, which, I mean,
They kind of were.
kind of, but also it feels like it's 1,000 years too late. Uh-oh. I don't know. We don't, personally, if it's me, we don't even know if that's really him, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
But, like, just to borrow a rib, that's something we do. But meanwhile, excavation work continues in Turkey, where researchers recently discovered a sarcophagus they believe may have been the saint's actual burial place before that 11th century theft.
The historical Nicholas was a man of extremes. He was a wealthy orphan who gave everything away, a prisoner who refused to break, a temple destroyer who stood up for women's safety, and a brawler who fought for his king. The Santa Claus we see today in malls shows is kind of a shadow of the man, but the core remains. He is the one who shows up in the dark, whether to toss gold through a window or to stand between a prisoner and the executioner's sword. In 2004, a team of researchers and forensic scientists at the University of Manchester used the latest technology to recreate the face of the man buried in the crypt in Bari, Italy. They didn't use paintings or legends. They used x-rays and 3D measurements of the actual skull. The result was a far cry from the jolly, rosy-cheeked character we see on soda cans. So what do the bones tell us? The most striking feature confirmed by the reconstruction was his severely broken nose. It had healed asymmetrically, leaning to one side. This supports the historical accounts of him being beaten during the Great Persecution, or perhaps his physical confrontation at the Council of Nicaea.
Well, it's funny because then Arius just now, if that's the case, did Arius just swing back too?
Or he might have been
got
wrestled to the floor, realistically.
It's like watching priests get into a fist fight. I don't know. That would be a great TikTok.
I want to see fighting Santas, okay?
Yes.
Now, his stature Nicholas was a man of small stature, standing only about 5 foot 6 inches tall, 1.68 meters. So you and I would be looking down on him because I'm
Yep.
a 6 foot tall woman and you're what, 6'4"?
6'2", but yes.
So his bones showed signs of severe chronic arthritis in his spine and in his pelvis. This points to the harsh, damp conditions of the Roman prisons where he spent his prime years. But the reconstruction reveals a man with a heavy jaw, olive skin, and the distinct features of an ancient Greek Anatolian living in the 4th century. His face, weathered, scarred, and tough, is the real face of Christmas. When you look at him, you don't see a magical elf, you see a survivor. You see the man that stood in the darkness with a broken nose and a hungry belly and decided that the world needed more kindness, not less.
Well, unless you're worshiping Artemis.
Unless you're worshiping Artemis. Unless you're a woman.
Or a heretic, and then he'll punch you in the face.
The thing is, I don't even see it as heresy, realistically. But
I don't know. That's a whole
that is a
rabbit
hole we will go down eventually.
Mm-hmm.
He transformed his suffering into a legacy of secret giving that survived the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages, and the Industrial Revolution. Even if he wouldn't recognize the red suit or the flying reindeer, he would certainly recognize the spirit of giving to those who have nothing, because that was the mission he began in the streets of Patara over 1,700 years ago.
So, if you like what you heard today, please give us a positive review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on. It goes a long way for us to appease the algorithm gods that St. Nicholas most certainly would not approve of, and gets this suggested to others just like you. The more we can connect, I like that.
I do.
The more we can get, the more we can connect to our fellow history nerds, the more we can build up a community and keep the show going.
Also, we have a Patreon where you can hang out with us and get exclusive content, like videos where we might try to make some ancient recipes to give to gods, talk about topics that couldn't fit into the main arcs of the podcast, and just generally being batshit and dumpster fires. All for the price.
Like St. Nicholas.
Like St. Nicholas. All for the price of a latte per month. Research materials and books cost a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time for us to create the show, so anything that you can provide would be a huge help.
And we can't wait to see you again. Well, at this point next year, I think. And as always, thanks for listening.
Happy
holidays, and bye for now.
Bye, guys.